This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 4, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is the pivot figure of the English Reformation. It was through her that the political and social phenomenon called Protestant England came into the world. She was not, of course, the cause of the movement, still less the cause of its final result. Innumerable causes converged toward that, but the movement would not have been launched, would not have been directed towards the goal which it ultimately reached, had not Anne Boleyn so completely dominated the King of England as to compel him ultimately to break with the unity of Christendom. And though Henry remained deeply attached to the Catholic doctrine and practice until his death, once he had broken with unity, that is, with the papacy, there was a breach in the dike, and the flood was ready to pour through. Not only was Anne Boleyn not the cause of the great affair, but still less was she the inspirer of it. Least of all the actors, with the exception perhaps of Henry himself, was she filled with any conscious intention of effecting such a result. The personality to whom must be given that role of inspirer, the mind which planned the origins of that great change and made it likely to succeed through economic as well as religious policy, was the mind of Thomas Cromwell. Anne, then, was neither the cause nor the inspirer of the first movement away from Catholicism, but she is what I have called her the pivot figure. It is because she was what she was and did what she did that England is what England is today. It is therefore of the first importance to history to understand what this woman really was and the real place of her action in the whole scheme of the time. From her day to our own, it has been taken for granted by all national tradition and by every historian that she lay at the origins of the English Reformation. But latterly, there has arisen an effort to weaken or question this sound tradition and to explain in other ways the quarrel between Henry and Rome and the ultimate effect of it. This effort at supplanting true history by false is part of the general skepticism of our time, which is usually ready to accept anything new because new falsehoods sound more picturesque as a rule, than well-worn truths. But here, there is a more powerful motive to make the origins of the change of religion in England look a little less ignoble than they really are. That is why Professor Pollard, for instance, who is the chief authority on the details of that period in England, tries to maintain the fantastic theory that Henry's attempt to get rid of his wife was not connected with Anne Boleyn, but with larger reasons of state, and that he had had the policy of getting rid of Catherine of Aragon in mind for many years before he met Anne Boleyn. The idea is not only fantastic, but desperate. It has no chance of being accepted out of England, and I do not think it will be accepted even in England, save by those who are very hard up for material in the whitewashing of Henry VIII's character. No, Anne remains and will always remain at the origins of the catastrophe. It behooves us, therefore, to understand her and her effect as best we can. Anne Boleyn was a Howard. That is the first thing to grasp in connection with her, and it is all the more important to grasp it because historians have failed to stress as strongly as they should have stressed this capital feature in her position. She was a Howard through her mother, who was the daughter of that old Duke of Norfolk, the victor of Flodden, and who was the sister of his son Thomas, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, who played a great part throughout the whole of Henry VIII's reign. The Howards were semi-royal. They had a somewhat different character from all the other great English nobles, although the family was not remarkably old, and the reason of this particular character of theirs was that they stood for a younger branch of the Plantagenet family, which was the true blood royal of England. The greatest of the Plantagenet kings, Edward I, one of the chief figures of the height of the Middle Ages, the contemporary of St. Louis and of Alphonse of Castile and of St. Dominic, had a young son Thomas, generally called Thomas of Brotherton. He gave him vast estates, the title of Norfolk, and the hereditary post of Earl Marshal of England, that is, head of the English armed forces. The family of this Thomas soon ended up in an heiress who married a Mowbray, whereupon her husband took on the title of Earl Marshal and all the tradition of the younger Plantagenet branch. The Mowbrays again soon ended in an heiress who married a wealthy private gentleman of legal descent, but one already possessed of land in East Anglia. The private gentleman was called Howard, and his son took over the tradition of Thomas of Brotherton and of the Plantagenet younger line. He was hereditary Earl Marshal of England through his marriage, and he was made Duke of Norfolk, the title of Duke being at that time of quasi-royal significance, and only given to those who were of royal blood or represented a branch of it. In Anne Boleyn's time, the Howard marriage into the blood royal was already more than a century old. This Howard, who thus became Duke of Norfolk, only acquired his title 30 years before Henry VIII came to the throne, and though they were not under the name of Howard, and through the male line of any great importance, they were very important as representing the continued tradition of the Earl Marshalship and the younger Plantagenet blood, and as having a dukedom with its connotation of connection with the crown. This first Duke of Norfolk had fought against Henry VIII's father, and his title had been taken away from him, but it was restored to his son, the one who was victor at Flodden, as I have said, who was called the second Duke of Norfolk, and it was inherited by his son again, Thomas, third Duke of Norfolk, the uncle of Anne Boleyn. So, Anne Boleyn comes to the court of Henry VIII under the introduction and auspices of the Howard connection. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a very wealthy man, nothing like the equal of his wife socially, but of considerable family importance through his mother, of the Irish family of Ormond. On his father's side, he was descended from big merchants in the city of London. He had considerable talent, especially as a diplomatist, and was used by the government on many occasions. Now that we have understood who Anne Boleyn was in the high society of England at the time, the next thing to understand is her age, appearance, and character. Oddly enough, considering what a great position she held even before captivating Henry, we are not quite certain of the date of her birth. It would take up too much space to marshal all the arguments here which have been advanced for various dates. The one most generally given, 1507, is almost certainly wrong. I myself incline to 1502 or 1503. At any rate, it was earlier rather than later. This point is of importance because her age has a good deal to do with our understanding of the way in which she intrigued and of her capacity for fulfilling her ambition. If she were born in 1507, she would be only 18 when Henry began to understand that he could not have her unless he married her, and she would have only been 14 when she is first talked of as mixed up in an affair. That is why 1507 seems to me an impossible date, for men were already claiming to be her lovers as early as 1521. On the other hand, if she were 18 in 1521, and over 20 when she began to make it clear to Henry that he must marry her, and that she would not be his mistress, the whole state of affairs became explicable. Anyhow, we may take it that round about the year 1525, this young woman was something between 20 and 23 years of age, and had thoroughly captured the king. She was about the court both as the daughter of her important official father and as an attendant upon the queen, Catherine, but also in another connection which is important, though unpleasant, to recollect, because it helps to explain Henry's action. Her younger sister Mary had already been the mistress of Henry VIII in very early youth, and he had got rid of her by marrying her off to one of his gentlemen. She is usually called the older sister, but this is a mistake. Anne's appearance was singular. She carried herself rather badly, was flat-chested and round-shouldered. She had a very thin neck, with the Adam's apple prominent and large, to which it was thought she owed her really fine contralto voice. She also had very long, dark, glossy hair and powerful black eyes. Beautiful in any ordinary sense of the word she certainly was not, but she had a strange and not healthy power of fascination, at least over certain types of men. She was slightly deformed. The little finger of one hand was double. Those who would flatter her called it 2 nails. People on the other tack roundly said that she had 2 little fingers. It was a defect which she was always at pains to conceal as best she could. She used her fascination calculatedly and coldly, and she so used it from a very early age. When she may have been anything between her 16th and 18th year, more probably about 18, in the year 1521, she so caught and entangled the heir of the greatest non-royal family in England, the Percys of Northumberland, that he was hopelessly in her power. He remained till his death full of that memory, long after he had to give her up, for when she found she had a chance of higher game, she got rid of him at once. Meanwhile, she had a second string to her bow, even at that early period, in another conquest of hers, Wyatt, a gentleman closely connected with Henry, not a pleasant character, and one who later, I think, traduced her, pretending that she had been his mistress as quite a young girl. I do not think this is true, because of what we know of Wyatt's character, and what we know of her own, which was frigid and determined to make the most of every opportunity. There was nothing impulsive about her. She would not have ruined her chances by yielding to a man in Wyatt's position. It was probably as early as at this time, 1521, that the king, who was then a man of 30, began to consider her. He probably also had about that time, and certainly immediately afterwards, given up living with his legitimate wife Catherine, although there was no outward semblance of any breach between them. He had already had other adventures, and that illegitimate son born to him by Elizabeth Blount, a lady who had been an old playmate of his in early youth. We have seen also how he had taken Anne's sister Mary for a mistress and discarded her. I have said that this point should especially be borne in mind, because it helps to explain the way in which Anne, who seems to have had much more willpower than her sister, attracted him. He was evidently drawn to the family type. We must presume, of course, that Henry, at this early stage, did not intend marriage. He sent sharp orders that the engagement with young Percy should be put to an end, and used Wolsey as his agent in so doing. Some think, however, that he was thus acting as early as 1521, rather with the idea of making a marriage for Anne as heiress for the Ormonds, and thus using her politically. Whether this were so or no, at any rate, soon after he intended to make her his mistress. We have no documents, we can only judge by the nature of the case and by what followed, but it is fairly clear that some time before, or in the very early part of 1525, when Henry was 34 years of age, and Anne well over 20, perhaps as much as 23, there was some arrangement between them, and that Anne had already given Henry to understand that she would not be his mistress, but would envisage marriage if he could get rid of Catherine. In that year, her father was raised to the peerage and given a new and more prominent position, and in that year we also have large gifts from Henry to Anne, and Henry interfering with her movements and saying where she is to stop. It does not follow that Henry had thus early accepted the idea of marrying Anne. He probably still thought she would come his mistress at last. To attempt the repudiation of Catherine, the niece of the Emperor of Germany and the King of Spain, the most prominent woman in the greatest family in Europe, would be a very serious business indeed, and Henry's hesitating and uncertain character would hardly come to a decision at once in the matter. In the summer of 1526, he had taken the first steps towards getting the marriage with Catherine annulled, upon the plea that the original dispensation for marrying his deceased brother's wife was invalid. In 1527, he took open steps in this direction, and for the divorce, as it was called, though of course it was an effort at annulment, footnote, that is, a declaration that the previous marriage had been invalid, and thus no marriage at all, editor, 1992. And not a divorce in the modern sense of the term, for in those days when everybody was Catholic, divorce in the modern sense was not conceivable, and thenceforward for 5 years, Anne tyrannized over him more and more until the unfortunate man was hardly sane in regard to her. She could do what she willed with him, and drove him at her discretion to the most impossible public actions. In order to get her, he began that worrying of the Pope, which ended at last in the complete breach with Rome. What exactly the relations were between them during this interval we can guess rather than prove, though even our guess must be of a tentative character, as it is also of a displeasing one. Displeasing though it be, it is necessary to have some precision in the matter, because unless we appreciate the relations of these two, we shall not understand the complete subjection into which Henry fell. She would not allow him complete satisfaction until she was virtually certain every obstacle having been removed by the death of the old, very Catholic and saintly Archbishop Warham. that even if the papal court did not grant annulment, Henry would take the matter into his own hands and marry her. She thus began to live with Henry as though she were already married to him, somewhere about September or October of the year 1532. Before Christmas of that year she was with child. Her chaplain, Cranmer, had been marked down for the Archbishopric of Canterbury. He was enthroned in the March of 1533, pronounced the marriage between Henry and Catherine null and void, proclaimed Anne to be the legitimate wife of Henry immediately after, and had crowned her queen in Westminster a few days after the sentence. Her child, who grew up to be Queen Elizabeth, was born in September of that year. Now began the process which may be observed in parallel cases in all times and places, including our own day. It was a case such as many of us have come across in our own observation. Henry, having been driven pretty well off his head by this woman's pertinacious handling of him, and refusal for so many years to surrender herself completely to him, was now, that he obtained satisfaction, changed in her regard. She had a bitter tongue, not without wit, using the French language in which she was trained, in which she thought as well as spoke. She ridiculed Henry behind his back, and he got to hear of it. Her fine voice and singing had ceased to attract him. Perhaps it had also deteriorated. She had accumulated enemies by her violent fits of temper, which she had never restrained in her angers with Henry himself. So it was not only the weariness of Henry with her, but also active irritation against her which began to change her fortunes. He was tired of her. He began to dislike her. Soon he hated her. And if they still carried on, it was only because Henry hoped that she would give him an heir, a boy. She probably would have done so but for his brutality, for a miscarriage which she suffered early in 1536 was by herself ascribed to his infidelity and roughness to her. She said she had been so pulled down by the whole business that her health had suffered. And we must remember in this connection that Henry himself had long been suffering from venereal disease. At any rate, a miscarriage she had. And what with his disappointment and his increasing loathing, Henry was determined to be rid of her. His character had deteriorated rapidly. Moreover, he was superstitious, and he seemed to have got it into his head that she had bewitched him. An indictment was framed against her, the validity of which I will discuss in a moment. She was accused of adultery with various people, including a couple of gentlemen about the court, one of the royal musicians of lower birth, and even with her own brother. Thomas Cromwell, then all-powerful, master of things spiritual and temporal in England, as the king's vice-regent over his new schismatic church and the king's lieutenant in civil affairs, was as determined as Henry upon her death, for would get rid of a rival. Henry had already determined who should succeed her, a certain Jane Seymour, daughter of a small landed gentleman in Wiltshire, whose sons were employed at court, while Jane herself was, as Anne had been, about the court, as a maid of honour. Henry and Cromwell used Cranmer to ruin Anne by frightening and threatening her after a pretended friendship, and Cranmer's action was the more base considering that his whole advancement in position were solely due to his having been a creature of the Boleyns and their chaplain. The wretched woman fell into an hysterical condition at the approach of death. She was left uncertain whether she would be burned or decapitated. On Friday, May 19th, 1536, she was beheaded with a sword within the precincts of the Tower of London by the headsman from Calais, specially brought over for the execution. Was she guilty of the misconduct ascribed to her? It is one of the most fiercely debated points in English history, standing as she does at the origins of the Reformation. The favourers of that movement have been hot in her defence. On the other hand, those who desire to exculpate Henry as much as they can exculpate that detestable character like to believe her guilty, while for the defenders of the old religion nothing was too bad to be put down to Anne. The accusations, especially that of incest, seem so monstrous that their very enormity is an argument in her favour. On the other hand, she was certainly unscrupulous in affairs of this kind, and she seems to have been quite unbalanced in the last year or two of her life. Some who have medical experience in these matters maintain that she suffered from a particular irresponsibility which makes the charges credible enough. I have myself always inclined to accept them, but many good students of the period with whom I have discussed the matter are divided, and some urge the strong argument that the two gentlemen concerned did not confess, while the musician who did confessed only under the threat of torture. Anyhow, they were all put to death as well as herself. Catherine had died before her. Henry's marriage with Jane Seymour, which took place immediately after Anne's death, was therefore quite legitimate in the eyes of the Church, and quite probably there would have been a reconciliation with Rome had it not been for Thomas Cromwell's having already launched the policy of confiscating church property, beginning with the monasteries, a policy which created a vested interest of great power against reunion. Anne's fatal action, therefore, had come just sufficiently late to start the ball of the Reformation rolling. She had not intended it. She had intended only to fulfill a petty and personal policy, in which she triumphed only to bring about her own destruction. But she will remain forever, in spite of lack of intention, the origin of that long movement which ended by the complete change of the English mind and character, and the supplanting, after a troubled and heavily contested struggle lasting over 150 years, of the old Catholic England by the new and modern Protestant one.